Okay, so you ready to jump into this? Today, we're going deep on this whole situation brewing in the Middle East, and it feels really, really precarious right now. You've got Yemen, the U.S., and then the worry that it could all explode into something much bigger.
And to make sense of this whole tangled mess, we're going to be looking at what Larry C. Johnson, Mark Sloboda, and Colonel Larry Wilkerson had to say on dialogue works.
Right, these guys have been around the block a few times, so their take on all this is really valuable. We're going to break down what they see happening with the U.S. in Yemen, how things could spin out of control with Iran, and what all this means for the whole Israel-Palestine situation, which is obviously already a powder keg. So let's just dive right in, huh? Starting with Yemen, was the U.S. bombing there justified, or is it a step towards a wider war, like some people are saying?
Well, Larry C. Johnson pulls no punches right off the bat. He straight up calls the U.S. bombing of Yemen an unjustified act of war, and he even uses the word murder when he talks about the civilian casualties, including children.
Whoa, that's a serious accusation. What exactly is his argument?
His main point is that before the U.S. started bombing, it seemed like the Houthis were actually honoring a ceasefire. Their threats and the things they were doing were all aimed at Israel, and they were specifically saying it was about getting a ceasefire in Gaza and making sure humanitarian aid could get to the Palestinians. So Johnson's saying the U.S. stepped in when the Houthis weren't actually engaging them, which makes it look like the U.S. is the one escalating things, maybe even doing it on purpose to have an excuse for a bigger fight with Iran.
He does mention some specific events to back that up, right?
Yeah, he talks about reports that the Houthis fired missiles at the USS Harry S. Truman, although he does say that the U.S. military hasn't officially confirmed that. And what's even more worrying is that he says U.S. bombing runs have killed a lot of people. He says at least 13, maybe even as many as 100, and that includes civilians in Yemen.
Yikes. So what's Johnson's take on the official U.S. position on all this?
He quotes Marco Rubio, who said the U.S. military is going to keep hitting the Houthis until they can't disrupt shipping in the Red Sea anymore. Johnson says that's basically a fight to the bitter end, kind of thinking just like what's happening in Ukraine. And that worries him because it means the U.S. might be in this for the long haul, which could be really costly.
It is interesting how he compares that to how the Biden administration handled things before. They were much more cautious, right?
Yeah, and Johnson says people who think Trump is just fixing Biden's pinpricks are wrong. He says those earlier U.S. actions weren't nothing, but they didn't really cripple the Houthis either. And he says that's because the Houthis are using mobile missile launchers, which are hard to hit, and the U.S. keeps bombing decoys.
And then there's the cost of all this. Johnson talks about how much money and tech the U.S. is losing, right?
Oh yeah, big time. He says the Houthis have shot down a bunch of those U.S. MQ-9 Predator drones. The exact number depends on who you ask. He mentions 30 drones based on Perplexity AI, and some other estimates say 15 to 18. But either way, that's a lot of money down the drain. These aren't just cheap little drones. They're high-tech aircraft used for spying and carrying out airstrikes, and each one costs over $13 million. So even if you go with the lower estimate, we're talking about almost $200 million lost. Maybe closer to 400 million or even $500 million if the higher numbers are right. And it's not just the money. It's a real blow to U.S. intelligence gathering and their ability to operate in the region.
Okay, so Johnson makes it sound like what the U.S. is doing is way out of proportion and maybe even making things worse. Now let's zoom out a bit and talk about Iran. Is Johnson saying that the U.S. is using Yemen as an excuse to go after Iran?
That's exactly what he's saying. He thinks the whole point of what the U.S. is doing in Yemen isn't really about the Houthis at all. It's about setting the stage for a military attack on Iran. And he says the people pushing for this are the same neoconservatives who always want war. And he thinks the Zionist lobby has a lot of influence, especially with the Trump administration.
And if I remember correctly, he mentions a specific report that fits into this pattern.
Yeah, he talks about a report from the Institute for the Study of War. It's about Iran's potential to build a nuclear weapon. Johnson says this is the same old song and dance. They play up the threat from Iran to get people on board with being more aggressive and maybe even going to war. He says this always happens when certain groups in the U.S. want to stir things up.
It does sound like he was hoping Trump would take a different approach, maybe try to calm things down instead.
Right. He's disappointed that Trump seems to be moving away from that peace president image he had going on before. Johnson's worried that Trump is now siding with the people who want to be more confrontational.
Mark Sloboda also weighs in on Iran, and he brings up some important things about the whole regional context that we talked about earlier.
What's really interesting about Sloboda's analysis is that he points out that any conflict with Iran wouldn't just be between the U.S. and Iran. It would drag in a lot of other countries.
Yeah.
He talks about all these tangled alliances and rivalries between different Arab states and, of course, Israel. And he makes a really good point about how important those waterways are. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Strait of Hormuz. Whoever controls those is going to have a huge advantage in any conflict.
And he asks a really good question about whether Trump is actually ready for something this complicated, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's basically like, how is Trump going to handle a war with all these moving parts, especially since he hasn't exactly been Mr. Popular with U.S. allies? He's saying that not having strong allies could really mess things up for the U.S.
And he brings up some really interesting points about who Iran is teaming up with militarily these days.
Right. He talks about how Iran, Russia, and China are doing all these joint naval exercises together in the region. And he points out that it's not just been for 5 years, like some people say. It's actually been 7 years in a row, starting back in 2019. So he's saying these exercises could mean that China and Russia already have plans in place to help Iran if the U.S. or its allies attack. And that adds a whole other layer of complexity to this whole situation.
That definitely changes the whole risk calculation. And Johnson also seems really worried that the U.S. is underestimating Iran. He thinks they're ready and willing to fight back hard.
Yeah, Johnson's like, don't think for a second that Iran is weak or that they're going to just sit there and take it. He thinks that Iran might retaliate by hitting U.S. military bases in the region like Al Udeid and Qatar and the ones in Syria. He even says it's possible that U.S. planes could get shot down and pilots captured. And that would obviously be a major escalation.
And there was something about Trump maybe trying to reach out to Iran diplomatically, even though things are so tense.
Johnson mentions a letter that Trump supposedly sent to the Iranian president offering to talk. But he also says that the Iranians probably don't trust Trump very much, especially since the U.S. is still threatening them and hitting them with sanctions. So it shows how hard it is to do diplomacy when you're also acting like you're about to go to war.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Israel and Palestine. The experts seem to think that what's happening there is really tied up with the tensions in Yemen and the possibility of a wider regional conflict. What do the Houthis themselves say about why they're doing what they're doing?
Johnson gets really fired up about how the U.S. government is talking about the Houthis. He quotes a statement from Pete Buttigieg, although he accidentally calls him Pete Hext.
Yeah.
Anyway, Buttigieg saying that the whole reason the U.S. is fighting the Houthis is to keep shipping lanes open in the Red Sea and to make sure the U.S. is seen as a strong force. He blames Iran for backing the Houthis and says the attacks will only stop when the Houthis stop messing with ships and drones.
And Johnson really disagrees with that, right?
Oh, yeah. He calls Buttigieg intellectually lightweight for saying that. His main problem is that it completely ignores what the Houthis themselves have said over and over again. They're saying they're doing this to force Israel to stop the genocide in Gaza. Johnson thinks the Houthis are acting directly because of what's happening to the Palestinians.
So he's saying that the Houthis aren't just attacking ships for no reason. They're doing it because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Exactly. He says instead of bombing the Houthis, the U.S. should be using all its power to get Israel to stop attacking Gaza and killing civilians. He thinks that's the only way to fix the root of the problem in the region, including what the Houthis are doing.
And there was also something about a failed attempt to get a ceasefire that involved releasing hostages in Gaza.
Johnson mentions that people from Mike Waltz's office and some Arab leaders tried to make a deal with Hamas. They wanted Hamas to release the hostages they're holding in exchange for Israel releasing Palestinian prisoners. But Johnson quotes someone named Witkoff who says the whole thing fell apart because Hamas wouldn't agree to the terms.
And Johnson has a pretty strong opinion about why that happened.
Yeah, he's basically saying that Witkoff and people like him always blame the Palestinians and call them terrorists, but they ignore all the Palestinian civilians who are dying because of what Israel is doing and the U.S. is supporting. He thinks this whole justification for attacking Yemen is part of the same pattern. It's a way to avoid dealing with the real issue, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it maybe even gives the U.S. an excuse to attack Iran, especially now that Russia and Iran are getting closer.
Now let's see what Colonel Larry Wilkerson has to say. He seems even more skeptical and worried about all this.
One of the first things he talks about is how he sees ceasefires in the region, and it's pretty bleak. He says straight up that Israel hasn't honored any of the ceasefires they agreed to with Lebanon or Hamas. He says over 500 people have died in Gaza, Lebanon, and the West Bank, and he doesn't even think Netanyahu understands what a ceasefire is supposed to mean.
Doesn't sound like he trusts Netanyahu to actually want peace.
Not at all. Wilkerson thinks Netanyahu never really planned to move forward with the second phase of any ceasefire agreement. He thinks Netanyahu is probably going to launch another big attack on Gaza, and he says Trump is going to let him do it, or maybe even encourage him.
And he also mentions some problems within the Israeli military itself, which is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, he talks about low morale in the Israel Defense Forces and says a lot of reservists are refusing to show up for duty. And Wilkerson says that means the IDF might not be able to handle a long, drawn-out offensive in Gaza. And then he says something really scary. He says there's a chance that all this could lead to civil unrest or even a civil war inside Israel because people are so divided and unhappy with Netanyahu.
Wow, that's a really disturbing thought. So what does Wilkerson think is really motivating the U.S. to do what it's doing in the region?
Well, he's pretty cynical about it. He says the U.S. is bombing Yemen again and probably backing another Israeli attack on Gaza because of the military-industrial complex. He says this whole system needs $50 billion every year to keep running, and that basically makes the U.S. a perpetual war state, which means they need to keep having wars to keep the money flowing.
And when it comes to a possible war between the U.S. and Iran, Wilkerson doesn't mince words. He seems really worried about what could happen.
He's totally blunt about it. He says if the U.S. and Iran go to war, the U.S. is going to lose badly. And he's not sure Trump understands that, especially since he got rid of all the people in the Pentagon who might have told him to be careful.
Wilkerson also doesn't buy the idea that bombing Iran from the air would actually solve anything.
Nope. He says bombing alone won't get the U.S. what it wants. And he says it might even make things worse because it could push Iran to build nukes to protect themselves. And then he talks about how bad it would be if the U.S. tried to invade Iran. He says it would be a disaster because Iran has a huge population and the terrain is really tough. He says the U.S. could lose all its power and influence the empire gone, is how he puts it. And he even says it could lead to a nuclear war. He brings up all the times in history when foreign countries have tried to conquer that part of the world and it's never gone well.
Going back to the Houthis and the Red Sea, Wilkerson seems to agree that they're going to be a problem for the U.S. for a long time.
Yeah, he brings up what Rubio said about how the conflict with the Houthis is going to keep going until they can't disrupt shipping anymore. But then he says that's easier said than done because the Houthis are really tough and they don't give up easily. He doesn't think the U.S. has the resources or the willpower to keep enough military power in the Red Sea to completely wipe out the Houthis.
And he's also worried about whether the U.S. military is actually ready for a big fight.
He says flat out that the U.S. military isn't ready and capable right now. And he says it's just a matter of time before something really bad happens in the Red Sea. He thinks the Houthis are going to do some serious damage sooner or later, maybe even hit a U.S. aircraft carrier. And then he asks how Trump is going to react, especially since the Houthis are saying they're doing all this because of what's happening in Gaza.
Wilkerson also talks about some of the shady stuff the U.S. has done in Yemen in the past, which is really interesting.
He tells this story about how the U.S. secretly gave weapons to a ruler in Saudi Arabia. He's basically saying that the U.S. has been messing around in that region for a long time and it hasn't always been good. And he totally agrees with Johnson that what Buttigieg said was amateurish and ignorant. He says the Houthis are fighting because of what's happening in Gaza and they're not going to back down.
And what about the idea that Iran is actually controlling the Houthis?
Well, Wilkerson says that when he was working for a congressional committee, he looked into that, and he didn't find any real proof that Iran was calling the shots. He says the Houthis have their own reasons for fighting, and they've had them for a long time. And he thinks the U.S. made up the whole Iran is controlling them story so they'd have an excuse to support the Saudi-led war in Yemen.
Which Wilkerson thinks was a total disaster for the Yemeni people.
He talks about how the Saudis blockaded Yemeni ports and the U.S. helped them do it, and that led to a lot of people starving to death. But he calls the Houthis valiant, courageous fighters who were just trying to defend themselves.
To wrap things up, let's talk about Trump and his relationship with Saudi Arabia and Israel. Wilkerson seems to think that Trump's whole plan for the region is falling apart.
Wilkerson thinks Trump got really close to the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, because he wanted Saudi Arabia to be a big power player in the region, both economically and politically. But he says that plan probably isn't going to work anymore because of what Israel is doing and because most people in the Arab world are siding with the Palestinians. He says the Abraham Accords, which were a big part of Trump's Middle East policy, are basically dead in the water.
And he's not very optimistic about the future of Israel itself.
He says he has serious doubts about whether Israel can survive as a stable and safe country. He says they could end up being seen as an apartheid state by the rest of the world, which could lead to all sorts of problems. He thinks they could get kicked out of the United Nations even. And he points out that Israel's economy was already in trouble before Trump, and now it's even worse, especially with the port of Eilat being shut down. He doesn't think Israel can stay safe and prosperous forever.
He also mentions the idea of an Israeli-Palestinian confederation, but he doesn't sound very hopeful about that either.
He says he's been listening to people on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict talk about the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, or IPC, but he thinks it's going to be almost impossible to make it work, especially since there isn't a real Palestinian state yet. He says the people who are trying to make this happen are probably wasting their time because Netanyahu isn't interested in peace and the extremists in his government have too much power.
So you listening, as we wrap up this deep dive into what the experts are saying, it's clear that what's happening in the Middle East is incredibly complicated. Everything's connected, and the stakes are unbelievably high for everybody involved.
Johnson, Sloboda, and Wilkerson all raise some really important points that we need to think about. They're saying that the U.S. might not have a good reason for getting involved in Yemen again, and that a war with Iran could be absolutely devastating. They're saying that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a huge part of the problem and that the Houthis are a much bigger threat than people realize. And they're saying that all this could end really badly for everyone, including the U.S.
So given all that and all the different, sometimes contradictory things the experts are saying, what do you think is the most important factor that's going to decide how this whole crisis plays out? It's a big question and one that's worth really thinking about and doing your own research on. This is something we all need to keep our eyes on because things are changing fast.